Thank you, Dr. Diaz, for that wonderful and comprehensive introduction, and I thank you. I thank you also for the invitation to open this really wonderful and stimulating day of conversations around the theme of the evolution of technology in the biomedical sciences. I've been thinking for many decades about the role of technology in changing health opportunities and life expectations for people with hereditary diseases, sickle cell disease, Tay-Sachs, cystic fibrosis, and many others, cancer as well, not hereditary disease, but cancer as well. And I'll really be drawing on these previous works to help to frame the conversation around what I've selected as my title, which is Technology, Diversity, and the Future of Health, the Social Predicament of Genetic Innovation. I'll be echoing some of the themes that I wrote about in a fairly recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine, Sickle Cell Disease, A History of Progress and Peril. Many of my remarks will hinge around the comparative history of these three diseases and the way in which technologies and technological innovation have created different life chances, different opportunities for people with sickle cell, Tay-Sachs, and CF. And I'll ask the question, what do these histories, in some ways you might say the past is prologue to the future of technology and innovation. So what do these histories tell us about genetic innovation and amid social diversity? What do they tell us about technology's impact on population health? What lessons do they carry for our understandings of progress in genetics, progress in genetic detection, the detection of genetic disease, progress in prevention or testing or, in fact, treatment? And then, insofar as they also give us ideas, they give us an indication of technological progress, they also provide cautionary warnings as we move into a new era of genetic testing, from genetic testing towards an era of gene therapy and gene editing. Now, what's interesting about these three diseases is that they have very common features. They're all identified in the 1950s as autosomal recessive disorders. The mechanisms of their inheritance is established in this time period. Carrier parents, parents who carry the trait, who marry other carrier parents, their children have a 25% chance of being affected with the disorder. And the mechanisms of inheritance suggest that these diseases are somehow, in a hereditary sense, parallel disorders, although clinically, of course, dramatically different. In the 1970s, they are all seen as potential targets for prevention given the rise of genetic testing and also the rise of genetic counseling. And from the 1950s onward, they become part of the identification of both the search for identification of causes, genetic causes, and hopes for technological breakthroughs based on that new genetic understanding. But as I want to suggest, there are also three diseases that offer cautionary tales because each disease presents a story of genetic innovation that has traveled very different paths shaped by the fact that these are very different populations. One disease associated with Ashkenazi Jews, another associated in the broad parlance with whites, that is cystic fibrosis, although that's not true, but that's one of the characterizations of it, and sickle cell disease, a disease associated with African Americans, although hemoglobinopathies are widespread around the world. The story of sickle cell disease, really the hallmarks, the milestones in its development in a clinical sense is the detection in 1910 by James Herrick of the sickled cells that were associated with the specific clinical manifestations of a disease that he named sickle cell disease. The 1940s and 50s really sees a transformation in what was regarded as a rare and unusual disease with the emergence of antibiotics, which, after all, people with sickle cell disease died not from the sickled cells, but from infections that commonly afflicted and caused pathologies and death. So the rise of antibiotics, effective antibacterial interventions in the 1940s and 50s, really had a transformative effect in how physicians saw sickle cell disease. Being able to treat the infections, a new disease became more clinically visible. The 1950s also sees the rise of a new theory of sickle cell disease, authored by Linus Pauling and colleagues. Many of you in medical school learn about sickle cell disease as the first molecular disease. And so the combination of both therapeutics, sickle cell antibacterials, and the rise of molecular biology, the identification of a missubstitution of amino acids on this complex hemoglobin molecule causing the sickled red blood cells, produced a new clinical visibility for sickle cell patients, turning a disease that was once seen as obscure into, as I said, this high-profile molecular disease. And in the 60s and 70s came, you might say, social visibility, as sickle cell disease became seen as a distinctively black experience in a time period in the civil rights era when attention was being paid to African American conditions, not just politically, but in this case, clinically. So it's in the 60s and 70s that sickle cell emerges and is characterized as a disease of pain and suffering among African Americans that had long been too long ignored. And you can see how the rising awareness resonated not so much with the science and the clinical, but with the social and political currents of the time period. Now, I want to say that cystic fibrosis was traveling a very similar trajectory in the 1940s and 50s, because the rise of antibiotics also expanded clinical visibility. So you have an article here from the 1950s that identifies cystic fibrosis as a great masquerader, and the same logic of applying antibacterials apply. Patients, of course, die from pulmonary disease, from infection. The age of antibacterial interventions in the 50s and 60s creates a new phenomenon, a new clinical visibility, such that the great impersonator is revealed as a new form of disorder. But this new regime of therapies, and this is a theme of technology and therapy in the 20th century that I think we want to think about as we look ahead. New therapies mean progress, but they also bring new dangers. By the 50s and certainly in the 1960s, practitioners who worked around cystic fibrosis pointed out that any regimen of long continued therapy with a single antibacterial agent invites the development of highly resistant organisms. So long before our contemporary formulation of multiple drug-resistant, TB, they were thinking about these problems. Highly resistant organisms which may flourish in an environment rendered more favorable by the absence of susceptible bacteria. And so new worries, you might say, new worries that were created by technological innovation, by therapeutic innovation, became the centerpiece of the worry for people with CF and the doctors who took care of them. Molecular diagnosis also fed a search for molecular solutions, as well as controversy. In the 1950s, in the wake of Linus Pauling's discovery, there were many predictions. I'll illustrate one. In medicine, imagining that medicine someday may be able to devise a small innocuous molecule which might lock onto the defective hemoglobin and prevent the abnormal molecule from misbehaving, a kind of a surgical, directed therapy, a molecular therapy for a molecular disease. And the dreams of this sort of molecular therapy manifest in the 1970s, with an ill-fated use of urea, which promised to be this desickling agent that hemoglobin experts sought, but really which showed no hematological effect, as well as severe toxic side effects. You might say that dream also returned in the 1990s with the discovery of the utility of hydroxyurea, which does stimulate fetal hemoglobin, characterized as a genetic switch, which reduces painful crises, but clearly is not a cure. Hereditary science also stirred controversy, such as when Linus Pauling wrote in the UCLA Law Review in 1968, in the age of genetic testing, I have suggested that there should be tattooed on the forehead of every young person a symbol showing possession of the sickle cell gene or whatever other similar gene that he has been found to possess in a single dose. If this were done, two young people carrying the same seriously defective gene in single dose would recognize the situation at first sight and would refrain from falling in love with one another. Now, of course, this sort of misses the fact that when you stigmatize two people in a common way, they don't really avoid each other. They actually be drawn towards each other because they carry a common stigma. But this shows you the way in which the misapplication, you might say, of this way of thinking about genetic causation or hereditary causation could lead in truly unfortunate directions. And so if you want to understand the controversies surrounding minority resistance to sickle cell genetic counseling, you only have to reflect on quotes like this from Linus Pauling. So the history of sickle cell disease is a history, therefore, of breakthroughs married with and intermingled with controversies. With genetic testing, you have debates about the lines between counseling, persuasion, and charges of genocide. With bone marrow transplantation, which emerges much later, you have the capacity for curing sickle cell disease, but you also have the high risk mortality associated with the procedure itself, and then you have graft versus host disease. With transfusion, you have the capacity of living a more fruitful and healthy life because of prophylactic transfusions, but at the same time, the risks associated with regular transfusion care. In the topic of pain medicine, you have a marriage of both progress and concerns. The picture on the front page of, on the cover of my book, Dying in the City of the Blues, which is a history of sickle cell disease, has this caption, which comes from a 1993 article. The caption underneath says, "Before you can get past the agony, you have to convince a doctor that it's real." And of course, there are questions of access, as well as questions about the ethics of screening people with trait, which was a really major source of controversy in the 1970s when people with sickle cell trait were banned from the Air Force, which a ban that was subsequently rescinded, but is resurged again in new controversies around the NCAA's decision to protect people with sickle cell trait, or perhaps discriminate, we're not quite sure which, by screening athletes for trait. So the history of sickle cell disease is, as I said, the story of therapeutic progress, technological progress, married with and alongside constant social controversy. And you have here a chart of rising life expectations. Tay-Sachs disease travels a very, very different story. One might call it success, others might call it failure. Discovered in the 1880s by Warren Tay and Bernard Sachs, associated very, very early on as exclusively observed among Hebrews, associated with very sharp and disturbing neurological and cognitive decline, especially in a young child who apparently is normal at infancy, but experiences the loss of motor reflexes, vision, and ultimately a very early death between ages, usually between 2 and 6, along with cerebral seizures. Widely seen by its prevalence as an Ashkenazi Jewish disease, although less known, high frequency in French Canadians as well as Louisiana Cajuns, and also across the US population. Following a similar trajectory, a discovery of the heterozygote carrier in the 50s, identified as a lipid storage disorder or lysosomal storage disorder in the 1950s, and then the discovery of the hex A deficiency, which leads to the buildup of lysosomes in the brain tissue. The 1970s also sees a high point in the desire to find cures, much in the way that urea was seen as a cure, a molecular cure for a molecular disease. Now that we know the cause, perhaps we can find the treatment to target. But as hopes for cures diminished because of the particular difficulty of delivering drugs through the brain, to the brain through the blood-brain barrier, even those who were associated with discovering the crucial mechanisms say that the prospects for the development of therapies in the near future are dismal. And it's in this context that a really dramatic embrace of prevention emerges as really the best possibility for people with Tay-Sachs disease and for parents. So genetic testing, you might say, is embraced much more avidly in the Jewish community than genetic testing is for in the black community for the reasons that I've been describing. And one social and religious innovation in Brooklyn really takes off and stirs admiration and ultimately later controversy. Rabbi Yosef Eckstein had watched as 4 of his children died with Tay-Sachs disease. And for ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York, where there was a strict ban on abortions, he needed another way for himself and his congregation. It was characterized as modern matchmaking. After all, in ultra-Orthodox communities, there is a tradition of the rabbi arranging the marriage. So if the information about Tay-Sachs carrier status could be somehow marshaled in service of proper matchmaking, you might actually be able to arrange marriages so as to prevent the birth of children with Tay-Sachs. This was called the Sheva Dor Yesharim, the generation of the righteous. Pardon my mispronunciation there. And it involved testing adolescents for carrier status, arranging marriages to avoid producing Tay-Sachs disease. And the practice not only started in Brooklyn, but spread and became extraordinarily successful at reducing the number of births from Tay-Sachs disease. But in 1993, that dream became a nightmare on the front pages of many newspapers when the Dor Yesharim asked a simple question: if this works to reduce the birth of children with Tay-Sachs, why not expand it to other diseases that also have high prevalence and are also associated with hereditary mechanisms, similar to Tay-Sachs? Why not expand it to other diseases like cystic fibrosis and Gaucher's disease? Gaucher is another lipid storage disorder where the clinical manifestations are not nearly as clear. So they expanded testing to other, not invariably diseases that were also characterized as high prevalence among Jews. And this is the way that innovation was greeted on the front page of the New York Times. Is it a nightmare or a dream, this new era in genetics? And the quotes from that article really illustrate the tensions. Dr. Michael Kabak, a medical geneticist, says, this mentality, unfortunately, has been fostered to some degree by the scientific community. If a test exists, you should use it. Mark Siegler, an ethicist at UChicago, says, as you move further and further away from an untreatable disease in which no one survives to CF and Gaucher's disease, I find the application much more troubling and much less acceptable. And Francis Collins at the time, who was really important in identifying a gene associated with CF, says this is a moderate nightmare. This is a miniature but significant version of Big Brother. It shows you how a success can turn into a nightmare from the standpoint of these practitioners very, very quickly. CF was also following a similar upwards trajectory, really buoyed by advances in technology, as well as advances in testing, and ultimately advances. And so the point of tension here was, is this method applicable, properly applicable to a disease like CF that's on an upward trajectory, where people are experiencing better health and rising life expectations? You might say what you saw in 1993 is a clash of genetic ideals between those who embraced the ethos of prevention and those who embraced an ethos of cures. And, 1993-94 was a high point in the belief that now that we had identified the gene or a gene associated with CF, we were closing in on a cure. We were able to replace the faulty gene. So what did this ethos of prevention mean in that time? Well, a supporter of the Dor Yesharim really shot back against the critics and says, while ethicists agonize over some people's being marginalized as marriage partners, they would do better to focus on the fact that medical conditions not manifesting themselves until middle age, like Gaucher's disease, do not make them benign. Prevention beats remedy any day. So the debate in the 1990s, you might say the past is prologue, but as a colleague of mine likes to say, quoting Mark Twain, history doesn't so much repeat itself, but it rhymes. And the question in the 1990s was, which genetic future does one want to pursue? And which genetic future to pursue amidst this kind of social diversity? The dream of curing CF, which followed immediately on the identification of the gene, and the vision of replacing this faulty gene, or the ideal of prevention. And underpinning this were fundamental questions about who right? The identity of the patients and the communities that are being served or disserved. Who has the right to define the future uses and misuses of genetics? If CF is, and fundamentally there's a kind of conceptual question, what is CF? Is it a Jewish disease or is it a Caucasian disease? As many in the press, like Frank DeFord, the sports writer and real advocate for CF would write. It's basically a white disease. So here you have black diseases, Jewish diseases, and white diseases all kind of in this mix as well. So just to conclude, I thought I would speak very quickly and help to frame the conversation. How does the past give us some insight into the present and the future? Well, the social predicament of genetic innovation, in my view, and these questions of technology, diversity, and the future of health all hinge around really 3 points. The first being that, we have to understand the new challenges that follow transformation of acute diseases into chronic diseases. Often in medicine, we strive for cures. We try to transform diseases in the same way that, penicillin could vanquish infectious disease. But we also need to understand that really one of the most dramatic implications of new technology and new therapies in the 20th century has been the phenomenon of transforming acute diseases into chronic diseases. That is the story, let's say, of penicillin and diabetes, right? No, I'm sorry, insulin and diabetes. It's the story of, that over time, what we've done is we've created, I hate to say it, more disease. We've actually created diseases as living conditions. So AIDS is a good example of how we've not ended AIDS, but we've really made AIDS into a livable condition through the innovations of the last 20 or 30 years. The second theme is that we must, in looking to the future, grapple with the ability to cope with medical, ethical, and social challenges that are caused by technologies themselves. And that is true if you look back in the story of genetic testing, right, where disease detection is very important, but it also causes stigma. It can cause discrimination if used and if misused. Or bone marrow transplantation, right? Figuring out the right way to pursue a possibility of cure while mitigating against the mortality associated with the procedure or creating a graft versus host disease in the name of solving sickle cell disease. When bone marrow transplantation was first being proposed for sickle cell disease, Ernest Beutler, a leading figure, innovator in bone marrow transplantation, wrote the following: "Little would be gained by sickle cell disease patients if they merely traded the mortality associated with the primary disorder for a new set of disabling symptoms resulting from their treatment." It's this dynamic, being careful to understand the challenges posed by our new technologies, that we must really think carefully about as we chart the future in technology. And this is also true in areas like pain medicine, and certainly with the development of new technologies of gene editing and gene therapy, where there is this unclear but certain risk of insertional oncogenesis associated with the technology. Finally, I'd like to say that the social predicament of genetic innovation involves very standard questions that we all are familiar with. The difficulties of translating technological innovation into better health. That will hinge on issues that National Academy of Medicine studies and encourages us all to think about. Questions about who controls the use of technologies. And I think of technological control broadly. Which populations will benefit? How genetic innovation relates to issues of group identity and well-being in a diverse US and also a diverse world. How society manages access. Whether we can anticipate and manage the uses and misuses of technology. And then finally, whether we can focus, right? I mean, often our embrace of new technological potential often involves a great deal of hype, really being swept up into the moment to dream of the possible end of disease. But we have to be careful that as we are swept up into those promises, sometimes verging on hype, that we do not lose sight of the fundamentals of care. And really, that's what I wanted to say by way of framing the conversation today, and looking forward to the panel to come. Thank you.